Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to pick back up on this series where I'm making a collage style quilt, and we've worked together from the very beginning, and today you'll notice that I filled in and connected all of these pieces to complete the larger sections of this quilt. And I had a post from Leslie. I'm going to show you right here. And Leslie said that it might be helpful for her and others to see how I actually sew these larger sections together. And so that's what I'm going to show you today. You'll notice that I've taken all these small individual blocks and made larger blocks out of them. We have quite a few partial and open seams. So I thought, let's move over to the design wall. I'll show you what it looks like as this up on the wall, all of my chunks. And then we'll go through sewing some of them together, and I'll show you my plan of attack for joining these larger sections together. So let's go take a look at all of this up on the wall. So here we are looking at the design wall. You'll notice that I started pushing everything up to the top, and so that we could fit everything onto it, and it does extend down to the floor a little bit. So all the gray areas that you might see in between the sections, those are our individual pieces and where they go together. And this is how it's looking so far. I think this is going to be a fantastic quilt. And today we're going to start piecing together these larger sections. So what I'm going to do is set up the camera and just hit record, and I will show you on the grid what sections we are putting together, and then I'll show you the process of actually sewing them. As we get started, I am thinking that I want to finish this seam here. In order to do that, I need to attach the green and red sections together right in that seam. I have the green and red sections here on my table, and I'm going to flip the red section over onto the green and line those pieces up. And once my quilt gets to these larger chunks of sections, you'll see that I usually use pins. I'm a huge fan of glue basting. However, once everything starts to get so large, I found that it's just easier for me to pin baste all of my seams together. You'll notice coming down here, we're going to have an open seam because this blue block does not extend all the way to the gray. So I will mark right here with 2 pins where I'm going to stop. And I'm just going to secure all the layers and move to the sewing machine. Also, with these larger sections, I usually do a back stitch at the beginning and at the end of the seam because we're going to be moving lots and lots of great big pieces that have some weight to them. And I want to make sure that these seams stay exactly the way they're supposed to and don't separate as we move everything together. So now we've attached the green and red section together, and I've colored all of that black. Now we can go back and do that first seam that I showed you. We're going to add this purple section to the top of the black section that we just created. To do that, I will fold the purple section down onto our newly created black section, and I will line up those pieces and pin them together. I usually pin from the top and work my way down, and once I get about halfway down, I'll move down to the bottom to make sure that these pieces are going to line up perfectly. You'll see that bottom section. I'm just making sure that that lines up. I'll pin that and then go back and fill in the rest of that seam with some pins. Now we can bring that to the sewing machine. We'll bring you in a little bit closer this time. I'm going to take a few stitches, some back stitches, and then we will sew this seam from one edge to the other. Going all the way down, trying to make sure that all my seams lay nice and flat. Keeping an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. And when we get to the bottom, I'll lock those stitches in with a few back stitches. And then I can press this seam and we'll move on. Now you'll see that I have colored in that section, and we can add the red section to the left. We're going to start here at the bottom. To add the red section, we're going to have a few different seams. And at this point, it all starts getting confusing because we have so many different open seams, so many different sections, and the pieces get really large. So I often look back at my grid to make sure I'm attaching the right section to the right section. We'll pin that in place and sew that seam. So the seam that I just did is right here, right there. So now we can go in and take a look at that. From here to here is what we just did. So we have this open seam and that open seam. We can flip this section down and finish the one open seam on top of the blue block. I'll pin that together. And sew that from where we left off with our stitches here all the way to the edge. So bringing you over to the sewing machine to show you this part, I'm going to make sure to align my needle right in where the stitches are. That should be an accurate 1/4 inch seam. And I'm going to back up into the stitches that are already there. And I will start with some stitches and do some back stitches. Make sure that that's really locked in place. And then I will continue that seam from there all the way to the edge. Now you can see it starts to get a little bit awkward because you're holding other sections of the quilt out of your way. That's one of the reasons to do your back stitches when you have a partial seam, because you're going to have pieces just hanging and dangling all around. We'll do some back stitches, lock that in place, press that seam, and we're ready to move on. So now I have everything back on my table. We just finished this seam right there. Let's see where we are. So we just finished that seam. We're going to move up. And you'll notice, once I get it all flattened out, that we can't yet do that seam because we have some loose sections right above this seam and that seam that need to be joined together first. My table is so slippery. So scooting everything over, what you'll notice that we need to do first is to move up and do this seam first. Once that's attached, we can start joining the next seam together. And you'll see I'm just going to flip everything right around, pin that top section together first, and then I'll sew that seam. See how I line that bottom edge together and then go back and fill in with the pins? Now we have that seam sewn. Now we can move back and we can finish the open seam right above that white block and underneath of the heart block. So I'll flip the top of the quilt over and line up these two seams and pin everything into place. So the seam that I'm getting ready to sew is this seam right here. So now that we just finished this seam together, we're ready to close everything up with the seam that runs. That's what we just sewed together right here. And now we have this open seam that extends vertically from the pinwheel block all the way down into the Lindsay block. So now we can flip those right sides together and pin that seam in place and sew that seam to close off this section. So I'll bring you along for this seam as well. Again, when I start sewing together this seam, I usually go back into the stitches that already exist there, do some back stitches, and then continue sewing the seam. When I get to the bottom, I will go into the stitches that already exist, do some back stitches, and that seam will be done. Right where my fingers are, that's where the stitching left off from that previous open seam. We'll go beyond where we left off and then lock that in place. So let's take a look at what this whole section looks like that we just pieced together. So now that we've assembled these 4 different pieces together to make one larger section, we're going to go ahead and move on. So I'd like to attach this blue section next. However, you'll see that the blue section extends from down here into this red section all the way to the top. So to do this one continuous seam, that means that I need to join this red piece to the bottom of this black piece right in this seam here. Once I join this seam together, I'll be able to come down and complete this seam. The bottom of this little heart block will be the same length as the bottom of this black section. So I'm going to join this section first, and then I will join this section here, and then that will turn this section black, the same as all of this, which will now give me one continuous seam from here to the top of the quilt. Once I do that, I can come back and finish this seam right here. So I think I'm going to do that. Once I get this section completed through here, I'm going to color it black. We're going to come back so that you can see what this looks like before we attach this blue section. Okay, we are back from joining this section to this larger section, and now you can see after completing those two seams, now we have one large section that extends right below this blue section here. So this is fairly easy. We're going to join this seam and then finish this seam all the way up. This is going to give us the top portion of our quilt, and then we're going to move down here. Now that we've attached the blue section, you can see the whole top portion of our quilt is all one section. Now we're going to put this off to the side for a minute because we're going to start to assemble the bottom portion of this quilt. My game plan is to have this section and then sew all of this together to make a section, and then we'll have one seam to join both halves of the quilt together right through here. So to join this bottom portion into a section, the very first thing I'm going to do is let's take a look at the seam between this green section and the pink section. If we join this seam from here to here, that will give us one larger section. The next thing I'll do is piece in this smaller blue piece right through here. And that'll give us one last seam where we can join this purple piece right in this seam here. That will join all of these four pieces together and make one large section that we will add to the top of the quilt. So let me go ahead and sew these seams. At this point, because the pieces are so large, it's a little difficult to bring you along for the sewing process. So I'm hoping that earlier when I showed you those parts of the video that was helpful for you. At this point, we're just going to do the same method, just different pieces. I'm going to go ahead and join these two together, and then we'll come right back. So I've attached these two pieces, and now this is one solid piece. I'm ready to start joining in this blue section. I've brought over the blue section, and I have this green section on my table, and I want to show you the order in which I'm going to sew these seams. So here we are. Here's my blue section, and that's loose just like that. It's going to fit right along this seam here, just like that. So the first thing I want you to notice is that that is an open seam. This is an open seam. So in order to join this seam here to this, we have to first connect this piece here. Moving everything over so that you can see it. This is an open seam as well. And the openness runs into this next block over here. So before we can finish off this seam, we need to join this seam here. And I know it's all probably sounds really confusing. But this here needs to be a finished seam so that we can finish the seam from here over to the edge right there. Once that seam is done, then we can finish this seam to the edge of that pink block right down there, and then we can sew that seam and finish adding in this blue section. So let me just show you what that looks like on the paper. Going through those motions, looking at the graph, we are going to do this seam right here. This again will be an open seam right up here because this blue block does not extend to the top of this now green block. So we will have one left open seam left where we join these larger sections together. So I'm going to start right here and I'm going to finish this seam. Then I'm going to start right here where this open seam is, and so from here to here. Then I'm going to start right here where this open seam is, and I will finish down to here. And then I will finish the open seam that exists right here all the way to this point here, and that will sew in our blue piece. Then it's going to be really easy. We'll only have one straight seam that goes from edge to edge with this purple piece. So let me go sew this in, and while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and add this piece too, and then we're just going to have two large sections left. Here we are. We're almost done with this quilt top. We have two great big sections left to join. So what my plan is to start right over on the left side, and I'm going to complete this seam from here to here. And then I will have a seam from here to here. And then we're going to go from here to here. And then I have this little tiny open seam that is a 2-inch block right there. This little tiny seam right there will come over to here. And then again, I have another 2-inch open seam right there. And our last seam will be from here to the right side of the quilt. Now, I really would love to bring you along, but I think it's all going to be jumbled because these sections are so large that I'm tossing everything around my table and you really can't tell what's what. So I think I will leave that part out, and what I'm going to do is turn on some music and just finish up. Let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 seams left for this quilt. I think I'll do that, and then we'll come back when this top is all together. I hate to leave you out of that part, but I think it's just going to be so jumbled up, you're not really going to see exactly what I'm doing anyway. So let me do that, and then I want to show you what this quilt top looks like all assembled, and we can celebrate that it's all together. So now we can celebrate because this top is together. Now it is extremely way too heavy for me to try to finagle it back up onto the wall at this point. So I just have it draped over the frame, and we're just going to take a walk around this quilt top so that you can see how everything came together. I think the quilter's cotton, the different patchwork blocks we added to this quilt has really added a lot of charm and character to this quilt. We'll just take a look at all the different pieces. Up through there, and then it's draped over to the other side of the frame. So let's pause that for a second. We'll take a look at that. And of course this section is going to be upside down. It's just hanging over the edge of the frame. But I guess most importantly, I just want you to see all of the different blocks and how everything came together. So I'm really pleased with this. Tomorrow I will be purchasing the backing and the batting for this quilt. And let's see, this quilt is 88 inches wide and 104 inches long. So it's a really nice queen size quilt. And let me move back to the other side because everything's upside down. There we go. Now I know that seeing it on video can be pretty confusing, and I try to explain it the best that I can, but my best advice is, if you've never done a quilt like this, is to break out some scraps. You know, you can use any type of scraps that you already have. Break out some fat quarters, make yourself some cute little blocks, and experiment with the partial seams. Because I will tell you, I watched several videos on partial seams and I never really got it until I sat down with some blocks and did it myself a couple of times. And then it started to register for me and it started to make more sense. And so that's my best advice, really, is to just practice with it. And before you start sewing together your t-shirts, practice with some scraps. And I think once you actually do it a couple of times, then it all will get so much easier and make a lot more sense. So I do plan on bringing you along for the quilting of this quilt. My plan is to do a small meandering throughout this quilt from edge to edge. I may do a couple of hearts because we have some hearts on this quilt, and it's for a really special mom, so we might do that in there too. But yes, I'm celebrating because all of these pieces are together. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, you can jump down to the comments section. And if you want to share pictures of your quilt, make sure to jump to the Creative Crew group. And we would love to see your quilts over there. I'll put a link in the description box. And I look forward to seeing you all really soon. Bye, everybody.